want to focus on the ability of using YAML and pulling in those existing configs. So what I want to do now, and because of time, I need to kind of get into this a little bit more, is I'm going to bring up the Ansible automation platform. And I'm actually going to do a quick check over here just to make sure we don't have any questions sitting in chat. Looks like we're good for now. So that's kind of all the backdrop of how to automate, right? So now let's take a look at the actual automation. And I will say that we're using the Cisco sandbox, so it may not work. And if that does happen, I'll fire up my server in my office real quick and we'll use my simulator. But normally it does work, but every once in a while, things are not good in the always-on simulator. But I'm crossing my fingers and hoping that everything is okay in that regard. So I'm going to go ahead and log in here. And I want to show you some of the playbooks. But before I do that, I want to kick this first one off. So this first one was just, simply making that move from like other tools like a Postman, where we potentially are taking advantage of like CSV files. And we're able to use those as input for our modules to create a workflow to configure the ACI. So let me go into that particular workflow. That's this first one. This ACI is code. And this is a workflow. So what's happening here is I have several roles that represent day 0 and day 1 configurations. So it's going to run those playbooks from this job template. And if everything passes, we have this green line. So this is a success condition in my workflow. So it's going to move to this ACI day 2 health check. It's effectively checking the health score, as a consequence of what we configured here in this first stage or this first job template, or what we call a node in a workflow. And if that's all good, we'll go through the health check and then it'll pass. If the configurations are bad, or if we have like some Nginx problems in the sandbox, this may fail. And then we would go into an ACI rollback. So the way that works is one of the first tasks that we run when we connect to the ACI is we'll create a snapshot. And we name that snapshot. And then we can call that snapshot later if we need to roll back. So that'll take us back to before we made our change. This is a sandbox environment, so sometimes people are making changes like after we're doing stuff and things like that. So the second demo will account more for that. This one, we're just making a change and crossing our fingers everything worked, and then we should pass the health check. If not, it'll do a rollback. So let's go ahead and start this one. This is a self-service survey. The reason why I have this here is sometimes I change it if I'm going to use my personal lab when the sandbox doesn't work. So it's really more for me. But it's also something that you can consider using if you want to prompt operators for information. These become what we call extra variables. So this is just like some defaults that I put in here, but I can change these if I need to in any of these fields. And what happens here is like when I go to next, it converts those into variables, or more importantly, into extra variables. So these have a higher precedence, so they'll override any variables that may also be defined somewhere else in my playbooks or in my group vars, or somewhere else in Ansible where I may define those variables. We can override them here. So it's like a higher level of being able to define particular parameters. So I launched this thing, and you'll see that the workflow starts running, and then the job template should kick off here in a second. And then this takes a few minutes to do all the things, and we'll just take a look at it, and hopefully it doesn't fail. Just make sure that it gets started here. And while it runs, I'll just kind of take you through just some of the main points in the playbooks and the roles, just so you have a feel for what I'm doing. And in the slides, I'll provide you with the link for the repo, so you can go back and look at it later or apply this. Since it's a sandbox, right, you can run it against the Cisco sandbox, and it'll work the exact same way. I'm just going to do this just to make sure it needs to refresh. Sometimes it takes a little bit because it's doing inventory syncs and pulling down the source control from the Git repository. All right, so now it's starting to do stuff. So these are like fabric access policies. So it'll go through. The main thing that you'll notice right away is that it's reading these CSV files. And that's kind of the gist of this demo, understanding that part. So this is the GitLab for it that I mentioned. And there's other demos as well, but this one is the Cisco ACI demo in this link. And again, I'll provide the link. So if we go into the playbook for this one, we've got the day 0 through 1 here. And all I'm doing really is I'm providing some basic information in this playbook. So this high-level playbook is where I need to define in the play, right, the hosts that I want to connect to. So this is a group called APIC, and at the moment it only has APIC 1 in it, which is the ACI sandbox at Cisco. And then what I'm doing is I'm including roles. So roles are purpose-built playbooks that have been variabilized. And in this case, they're very specific to a use case or what some people might call intent. So each one is like serving a very specific purpose, so like creating the snapshot, creating fabric access policies, where you're connecting like the physical ports to these profiles. There's some steps there that you have to do. And then after those are there, you can create all your pools, like your VLAN pools, your domains, like physical domains, virtual domains. The AEPs is where you connect like these domains and make them available to use later in your tenant constructs. And in tenants, there's a lot of stuff, right? Because we kind of talked through that a bit, where we've got tenants and we've got EPGs and bridge domains and the like. And then if we want to, we can apply contracts. So there's the whole notion of the filters and the contracts, and then applying them so that way we can actually see them, visualized in our APIC, and then a layer 3 out. So those are the things that we're building. So if I go into this APIC here, and I probably should have did this a little bit sooner. So this is just the normal password that they use. And then we'll just click on tenants. And then you can see this is the one that we're building right here. So it's just, I named it Ansible, and it was created with AAP 2.4. So there's actually already some stuff in here. So I'm going to go ahead and just click through where it started to build things. So we've got access policies. So if we go into like switches, and I'll view these profiles. You can see the ones that say that are prefixed with Ansible. These are the ones that I'm building. So I have these. These are put together so we can have like our virtual port channels and those constructs. And also my layer 3 out uses this one, this Ansible corporate external. And then we're applying them to port interface selectors, right? So this is kind of like where we establish the policies, and then where they're actually using the ports. And this is like one of those areas where you run into conflicts sometimes. These are like the actual ports that it's using. So I'm using, Ethernet 150 for this layer 3 out. And then for these VPCs, I have a range of ports. And then I'm not conflicting with anybody else, because the only other person that did this is using 41 and 42. So we're good to go here. But it's good to know this information. Like I'm seeing it from the GUI. And the next demo, we're going to read it in from the fabric so we can see it before we make our change. So I just, know where to go in the GUI so I can check, this time that way. Or if we had a problem with any of this, I have to refresh it. All right, so here's everything that we did. Get back into pools, AP, domains, EPGs, bindings, the contracts. Right, and the other part of this before I go back to that is if we look in the GitLab repo, and I go back to ACI, these are the CSV files. So this is where I could repackage them. And I did this originally. I had a bunch of Postman runners, and then I had different CSVs, for different things that I'm configuring. It is a bit clunkier than using like YAML because it's just rows in a spreadsheet. So I have columns and rows. I don't have like the amount of nested capabilities that I have in dictionaries that I build in like YAML and JSON. So that requires me to kind of like have different CSV files. So I can't have like one CSV file. So I kind of have them kind of modular, and they group to certain things. So if I go back to here, like the day 1 stuff is different. So I've got like contracts, layer 3 out, static bindings. So if we go into this contract one, you can see that I have multiple rows. So the column is where we define the variable, right? And then each one of these rows is another configuration, right? So we just iterate through them, right? So I have more than one filter. I have this HTTP filter and these two SQL filters, right? And you can see, as it builds that out, it just iterates through them and it goes through, each one of these. Now, one of the things you have to be careful with these CSVs is like if you have like empty values and cells and stuff. So the way that you work around that is you can allow for that in your playbooks and your roles. So if I go back to here and go into a role, and we were in the contracts one, we're looking at contracts. So this one, oh, I'm sorry. I need to be further down. These contracts, J1 contracts. You'll notice that I have a filter. So here's where I'm pointing, into that data, right? So we read in these CSV files. So this read CSV is a module that reads in CSV files. And then we have those available to register into memory, so ACI contracts. And then I can parse to those. So what I'm doing here is, in this particular one, I've got, the filter item tenant, right? But if that was, well, that can't be empty anyway because, tenant is required. So that's not a good example. But if any of these like further down is something that that we have an empty value in our spreadsheet, then because of this default omit true, then it'll allow it to move to the next one without deleting what was already in there. So that was like the byproduct of it is if I had a value in there, it wouldn't skip it. It would actually delete it if the cell was empty. So just keep that in mind with CSV files. We don't have to worry about that as much when we're working with like the YAML and JSON format. So it's kind of just a result of just reading in these CSV files. But if you do that, everything works fine, and you can run this over and over again, and everything should work well. So because of time, I want to get to the better demo, so we don't go over too much. And so the last thing I want to do here is like we built that config. So I want to remove that config. So if I go down to ACI rollback, I'm just going to run that one itself. And then that'll remove everything we just built. And while that's running, we'll take a look at what the workflow said. So the workflow, like after it made the configuration, there was no configuration errors after it completed. And then we did this health check. So if I look at the output there, what we were doing is we were checking that tenant, that Ansible tenant that we created. And it had to be, the condition was that it had to be greater than 94. So that one is currently a health score of 98. So that assertion passed. So that way it's just a quick check to say, okay, you made some changes tenant related and none of them really impacted the health score to the point where we need to go, further drill down and try to figure out, exactly why it dropped so much. Sometimes you'll have 100%, and there's usually some things happen anyway because you have faults because of the licensing and things like that already in there. So it's kind of hard to get 100% depending on what your test environment looks like. In reality, a real fabric, should be 100%, as long as everything's good to go. So let's look at jobs. And we did the rollback. So it rolled back. So this is like the exact snapshot that it just rolled back. So I should be able just to quickly just go back here to tenants or all tenants. And it's no longer there. The Ansible was at the top because it was in alphabetical order. So that one's been removed. So let's jump back and do the second one. So templates. This is a different workflow. We'll kick that off. This is just here again in case I need to change the fabric. Now this workflow looks a little bit different. So this one here, we're pulling in the config, but we're doing it in a modular way, and I'll show you that in the actual files. And then it stops. So after we pull the configs in, we want to take a look at them so that maybe we want to modify the existing configs, or we want to add some new configs to push, into the fabric. So we have what we call an approval process. So this will actually stop after this, and it'll pause until we either approve it or deny it. And if we feel comfortable that we want to make our changes, then first we're going to deploy the new changes, and then it'll go through and look for anything that was modified in the existing configuration. If this wasn't the sandbox, I would also do like a diff check, but they change so much. I always have so many diffs, it doesn't make sense, because if I run this earlier and come back an hour later, or like whatever I saved, if I run it like the day before, it's completely different. So there's a lot of diffs. So what I do is I'm just renaming the configs or deleting ones that I don't need, but I could save them, and then I could always compare, do a diff to see, okay, when it's slight changes, then it makes sense. Like if it's your fabric, you shouldn't be making that many changes, right? But since it's the sandbox, there's just, it just kind of overloads you with differences. And then we do a health check again. And then if any of these two fail, it'll do a rollback. So if any of these two have configuration problems, then it's going to roll back. And then we would have to run, figure out what was wrong. And then we would run the workflow again to resolve that issue. So this one right here is just running, and you'll see that it's just collecting configs and it's converting them into YAML files. It's kind of going kind of quick, but you can see there's reads and then modifies. And then what we're doing is we're adding them to the variables in the role. So that's one of the locations where we can provide variables, and it has a higher precedence than a lot of other variables when it's the role variables. So it's higher than like the defaults. So that's where they're going for our new changes, and then the defaults are the ones that that we're going to change next, that were like the existing configs. So while this is running, I want to just pop over here and go into my ACI, and I need to go into the playbooks and the roles. And what you can see here is this is the playbooks that we're running to collect data. So I need to kind of drop this down so you can see it. And they're all kind of the same. So I have this block, so that way I can avoid like some of the repetitive commands. So we'll do a block in a role a lot of times for that purpose, so we don't have to do like delegate to local over and over again. You'll notice that I don't have to do the authentication. We're using the HTTP API, so it can actually read group and host variables, so we don't have to worry about that anymore. And we're leveraging queries. So this is how we're reading in configurations, but we're reading them in for very specific modules. So like here's filters, right? And then I have other ones for different things that we're configuring. So here's the access policies, right? So very similar, but it's just focused on different types of configs. And we're pointing, to specific configurations. So one of the things that we're doing is we want to, save those configurations, right? So that requires us to query it. It goes into memory. So we register it in memory. And then what we're going to do is we're going to call that configuration and convert it into YAML. So by default, it's coming in as JSON. That's how we export out by default using Ansible. That's what the module payload will look like. It'll be JSON from ACI. And we want to convert it to YAML, and then we want to copy it, after we modify it a bit. So we want to create, in this case, we want to remove current, because every one of these, the default is to name the dictionary of this config current, because it's the current configuration. What we want to do is rename that so that we can call that dictionary. So we want to call it whatever that particular configuration is. So in this case, it's the switch profile. So we're doing like manipulation. So we're manipulating this file. And then after we do that, we're saving it, right? So the way that it's saved is if you look at the playbook. So if I go to the playbook I'm on the access, fabric access, right? So if I go to brownfield, config, deploy, it's the config one. You can see that we have these roles that we're running, right? So we want to learn the fabric access, we want to learn the tenant config, we want to learn the contracts, we want to learn the layer 3 out, right? So we're going to iterate through all of those at the playbook, and then it's going into each one of these roles. So we were in this particular role, right? And then we'll iterate through like all the different fabric access types of things and VLAN pools and glean all that stuff, right? So then we have that there. And then what happens here is we want to prepare it such that we can modify it, right? So if I do well, let's make sure that it's done, right? So this one, it did all these things, it pulled all this, information in. So I should be able to go back here, and this is a repo. So for me to have like that new information, I have to do a git pull, because this is like the local repo, git repo that I'm working from in this VS Code, but I'm really connecting to a git t repo. So the GitLab is just where I'm showing you the code like publicly, but in the lab I have a git t repo that's just like a GitLab or a GitHub, and that's what's interacting with this local repository. So if I do a git pull, I should have the updated information come in, and see how like all these files just showed up when I did that. So these are the configurations that were learned. So those show up under the roles that say deploy. So if we were in Fabric Access Collect, so if we look at Fabric Access Deploy, you can see I have defaults. So these are the configurations that came in from the Cisco sandbox. So like if I look at AEPs, lease, switch profile, selector, VLAN pool, interface profiles, right? So one of the ones that probably has a lot of stuff is there wasn't a whole lot of this configured, but there's a couple of them, right? So you can see that there's these dashes, right? So there was more than one of whatever that object was. So we named the dictionary interface profile, and then each dash represents the actual name in ACI, right, for that particular construct, the interface profile, right? So infra instead of FV, right, because we're talking about these, not tenant configurations, we're talking about infrastructure configurations, right, when we're doing fabric policy stuff. So they're all prefixed with infra. So just to call that out to explain kind of what we talked about in the slides. So there's one, two, three of those in here. But now we know like the existing config of what interface profiles we have, currently, and what their configuration is. So we can see like all those parameters that were defined, like you have the name, right? Description. Here's a distinguished name, DN. See how it starts with uni and then goes to infra, doesn't go to tenant. But then it's going to ACC port profile. And then this is the name. See how there's the dash? There's always a dash after the prefix. And then this is the name for that particular object. So that leaf profile. Right. So we didn't have to understand this. We just read this in, and it's already packaged, for us. So one of the ones that's a little bit easier for most people to understand is tenant. So if I go into the tenants here, right? So here's the actual, role for configuring tenants. And then if I want to modify a configuration for that, then I need, I'm sorry, I'm in the wrong one. I need to be in this brownfield tenant deploy. Yeah, here. Default tenants. Right. So these are tenants that somebody had configured in the system, just arbitrary, whatever's in there at that given time. So some of these are like the ones that are already there, like the common tenant, infra tenant, management. And then these would be ones that people had configured today. Right. So some of these have descriptions in them. Let's find one that doesn't. So this TN telco doesn't have a description. So we're going to add one to this just to make a change. So I got to save this. Save. And then I need this to realize that it changed. So let me refresh this. And then this is just a commit message. And it was TN Telco. This is just so we can kind of remember if I forget. synchronize that one. So now we're synced. Let me go ahead. This will do an auto fetch every once in a while. So now we're synced with the GitT, right? So our AAP would use this particular configuration now when it pulls it in next time. The other stuff that we want to do is we're going to build new configurations. So I already have folders in here. So in this, let me shut this default one down. So in vars, I have these configurations. So my new configurations are in vars because that has a higher precedence. So it'll just run these. But then when I remove this in my workflow, then the next precedence down is the default. So it'll run whatever's in my default folders. So it'll run, based off of those configurations. So like in our tenant, we're just naming it Ansible, right? So everything is prefixed with Ansible. We'll see those configured just like we did with the CSVs, but now we're using YAML files. But then now that will become like the next, if we ran the workflow again, then it would pull those configs in, right? So these are new. They don't exist yet, but they're going in and being modified along with the existing state. And we already saw when I went to the GUI that we didn't have any overlapping ports and stuff, but we could check that here too because I have access to all those configs in the Fabric policies. So like I could look and see, what interfaces are used and stuff, from these configs. So to save time, and we actually went over a little bit, we'll say that like we've reconciled everything. We feel good about it, right? So now what I want to do is go back to this workflow and click jobs. And you'll see that the workflow continues to run because my approval is set up to wait, right? It doesn't have a timer to stop. It never expires. So I'm going to go ahead and approve it. And then what happens is it's going to kick off the next playbook, which is the brownfield deploy, which is going to configure the new stuff, the new configurations for ACI. So that's running here. And then if we jump back in here and like refresh this screen, we should see that pop up here. And it should build a tenant that is named Ansible. So maybe I'll pull this down like this so we can kind of watch it. And then we want to go back and see what's going on over here. So we haven't got to the tenant yet. We're still in the Fabric access. So one of the things we can do is make this smaller. And we'll jump over in Fabric access. Access policies, and we'll look at the interfaces. So we're using the same ports that we used last time. So it's gotten to that point. Now it's over into some tenant stuff. So let's jump back over into tenants. Right, so see we have the tenants here. And we've got our bridge domain and VRS and EPGs. But we'll wait here just a little bit longer to make sure that it builds everything. And we can see like the time elapsed. This usually takes about like 2 minutes or so to build this, this one new tenant with all these other constructs. Now the other one, we may not be able to let that finish because depending on how much config was in there, it could take a while for the existing configuration. See how I'm deleting stuff too. So just to show you that part, if I do a git pull, and then we go back into here like the collect, or I'm sorry, into the deploy ones, you can see how my vars, I renamed it to old. And the reason why I do that is because when I run the next set of playbooks, I want to use the default variables. So if vars was here, it would try to run them again because it has a higher precedence. So I just rename it so then I can run defaults. And then I could rename defaults something else and then pull in the configs again if I wanted to do a diff. That's how I normally do it because then I'll rename this something else and then compare that to the next time that I run and pull all those configs back from ACI, and then I can do a diff, which is kind of like a fool's errand in this particular Fabric because there's so much stuff in it. But in your Fabric where you have the configs that you expect to be there and you're not making like a bazillion different changes, then you'll see just the diffs of the things you're changing. And you'll be very easily able to pinpoint when someone goes in out of band and makes a change that's different for what you expected it to be in your configuration source of truth that you've saved, as these files. So we are done that. So if I go back to jobs, we've ran the deploy, and let's make this a little bit bigger. All right, so in brownfield config, we had a failure, which is actually good. So we can see, see it respond to that. So something failed. So it didn't like something in one of my filters. Sometimes what happens too is that people use dashes, and I've run into this a couple of times. See how I'm using a lot of underscores? Some of the configurations in the GUI, if you put dashes in, it works okay, but it's not valid for like automation, which is another one of like when you get into like naming conventions, especially with Ansible, you want to use like underscores. And I noticed that's broken these filters a couple of times, but I don't have time like to check that. I feel confident it's probably something like that, because it's just, it failed on that particular configuration of whatever their name was. Someone had configured one of these. It's not one of our things. So that's something to keep in mind too, is using names that lend themselves, to be variables, or to, as naming conventions that can be variabilized in Ansible. So underscores as opposed to dashes is one of the ones that comes up a lot. So I'm glad that that failed anyway, because what I want to look at is the workflow and see how it failed here. So it went to the rollback. So then in the rollback, it should have, went back and rolled back from a snapshot. So if I go back to, oh, my ACI is on a different screen. That's right. Not that one. Is it this one? Yeah. Then hopefully that worked as planned. So we'll refresh this. Actually, I think it did, because it should have been there. Like the screen must have refreshed on its own. Yeah, see how Ansible doesn't exist there anymore? So that's what happened. It did the rollback. So I did, to be fair, I did warn you that sometimes the sandbox does have some flaky things like that. I'm pretty sure that's what it is. I'll follow up on that, but I'm pretty confident it's probably, that's what breaks sometimes. It's just invalid naming and stuff like that people use in the GUI. So we went over a little bit, but thank you so much for attending. And